He built this company's success with his own two hands, and today, they were about to throw it all away. Do as I said, or quit. In that single second, everyone in the office understood Yang. This wasn't just a job to him. It was everything he had left. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply started packing a bon, and the silence that followed said more than words ever could. What the CEO didn't know was that this single dad's next move would leave the entire company speechless.
If you have ever been told that your job mattered more than your family, that a paycheck was supposed to outweigh a promise made to a 7-year-old girl, then stay with me for the next few minutes, because this story is for you. Before we go any further, if stories about real courage, real fatherhood, and real justice speak to you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened in that glass office on the 14th floor of Halden Logistics is something you need to see through, to the very end. Ethan Cole had not planned on becoming a single father. 3 years earlier, his wife Maren had passed away after a long illness, leaving him with a mortgage, a mountain of medical bills, and a bright, curious 7-year-old girl named Sophie, who still asked, every single night, whether her mother could see her from the stars. Ethan was 36 years old, and in the space of a single year, he had gone from being half of a partnership to being the only anchor his daughter had left in the world. He worked as the director of operations at Halden Logistics, a mid-sized shipping and distribution company that had, under his quiet leadership, grown from a struggling regional carrier into one of the most efficient logistics networks in the world. He had not done it for recognition. He had done it because the work was honest, because his team depended on him, and because every extra contract he landed meant one more year he could keep Sophie in the small brick house with the crooked porch swing that her mother had loved so much. Maren had been a middle school art teacher, the kind of person who remembered every student's birthday and kept a drawer full of granola bars for kids who came to school without breakfast. She and Ethan had met in college, in a shared statistics class neither of them particularly enjoyed, and had built a life together, defined by small, steady kindnesses rather than grand gestures. When she was first diagnosed, the doctors had been cautiously optimistic, and for nearly 2 years the family had lived in a strange, suspended rhythm of treatment and remission, hope and fear taking turns at the dinner table. Sophie had been 4 years old when her mother passed, too young to remember much beyond fragments. The smell of her mother's shampoo, the particular way she hummed while cooking, a blue cardigan that still hung in the hallway closet because Ethan could not bring himself to give it away. Ethan carried the full weight of those years quietly, rarely speaking of them at work, allowing colleagues to know only the barest outline of his story. But that outline had been enough for the people who mattered, the ones who had shown up with casseroles during Maren's final months, who had covered his shifts without being asked, who had simply understood, without needing an explanation, why he left promptly at 5:30 every single day. For 3 years, Ethan had made an unspoken agreement with himself. He would give the company everything during working hours, his intelligence, his discipline, his relentless attention to detail. But the moment the clock struck 5:30, he was Sophie's father first, and an employee second. He picked her up from Mrs. Delgado's after-school program every day without fail. He cooked dinner, even if it was just grilled cheese and canned soup on the hardest nights. He read to her before bed, doing every silly voice she demanded, and he never, not once, missed a single school recital, teacher conference, or father-daughter event, no matter how important the meeting waiting for him back at the office. This arrangement had worked for years because the previous CEO, a soft-spoken man named Walter Kim, understood that a company was made of people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Walter had built Halden Logistics with a simple philosophy: take care of your people, and they will take care of the business. Under Walter, Ethan had been given the flexibility to work efficiently within his hours, trusted to deliver results without being chained to his desk until midnight. But 6 months before our story begins, Walter Kim retired, and the board brought in a new chief executive from outside the company, a man named Richard Halden, no relation to the company's founder despite the coincidental name, a ruthless corporate turnaround specialist with a reputation for squeezing every last percentage point of efficiency out of struggling companies, regardless of the human cost. The board of directors had brought Richard in with a specific mandate: increase quarterly margins by any means necessary, in preparation for a potential acquisition by a larger national conglomerate that had been circling the company for over a year. Richard had been chosen precisely because of his reputation for ruthless efficiency, having previously led turnarounds at 3 other mid-sized firms, each of which had seen short-term profits spike dramatically before quietly hollowing out from the inside, bleeding talent and institutional knowledge until the efficient version of the company was barely recognizable from the one that had once thrived. None of that history had made it into the glowing press release the board issued the day of his hiring, which praised his aggressive growth mindset and unrelenting focus on results. Ethan had read that press release at his kitchen table the night it was published, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach that he could not quite name at the time, but which would prove, in the months that followed, to be entirely justified. Richard Halden arrived at Halden Logistics like a storm front. Within his first month, he had reorganized 3 departments, laid off 12% of the workforce under the banner of operational streamlining, and instituted a new policy requiring senior managers to be reachable and, in many cases, physically present in the office from 7 in the morning until at least 7 at night. He believed, quite genuinely, that visible exhaustion was a proxy for dedication, and that anyone who left before the sun went down simply did not care enough about the company's success. He had no children. He had never been married. His entire identity was constructed around the machinery of ambition, and he could not fathom why anyone would prioritize anything above it. Ethan had tried, quietly and diplomatically, to explain his situation during his first one-on-one meeting with the new CEO. He explained that he was a single father, that his daughter had no other family in the state, that he consistently exceeded his performance targets despite leaving at a reasonable hour, and that his department's numbers spoke for themselves. Richard had listened with an unreadable expression, nodded once, and said only, "Everyone has excuses, Mr. Cole. The ones who succeed here are the ones who stop making them." Ethan left that meeting with a knot in his stomach that never fully went away. Over the following months, the pressure mounted in small, deliberate increments. First, it was an email sent at 9 at night, expecting a response before morning. Then it was a mandatory leadership dinner, scheduled for 6:30, the exact time Ethan needed to pick Sophie up. Ethan had missed that dinner, choosing his daughter over the meal, and had noticed the chill in Richard's demeanor toward him ever since. Rumors began circulating through the office that Richard had started referring to Ethan, behind closed doors, as the guy who isn't fully committed. It stung, because nothing could have been further from the truth. Ethan was more committed to Halden Logistics than almost anyone else in the building. He simply refused to let that commitment cannibalize the only family he had left. The breaking point arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon in late autumn. Halden Logistics had just landed its largest client contract in company history, a 3-year distribution deal with a national retail chain worth tens of millions of dollars, and Ethan's department had been the driving force behind winning it. He had spent the past 6 weeks redesigning the company's regional routing algorithm, personally negotiating warehouse space in 2 additional cities, and coordinating a team of 40 people to deliver a proposal that had blown the competition out of the water. It was, without question, the single greatest professional achievement of his career, and everyone in the building knew it. That Thursday, Richard called an emergency meeting of the senior leadership team to discuss the onboarding logistics for the new contract. Ethan walked into the glass-walled conference room at 4 in the afternoon, expecting congratulations, expecting recognition for the work that had made this entire deal possible. Instead, Richard slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward him. It was a revised employment agreement, one that required all senior directors to relocate, on 45 days' notice, to a new regional hub 2 states away, with an expectation of 80-hour workweeks during the initial contract rollout, and language that explicitly waived any accommodation for personal scheduling conflicts. Ethan read the document twice, his heart sinking with every line. He looked up at Richard, keeping his voice level. "I have a 7-year-old daughter," he said. "She has no other parent, no other family within 400 miles. I can deliver this rollout from here, remotely, better than anyone else in this building. But I cannot uproot her life and move her across the country on 45 days' notice." Around the table, the other directors sat frozen, caught between their loyalty to a colleague they respected and their fear of a CEO who had already demonstrated, repeatedly, that he had little patience for dissent. Marcus Feld, the director of finance, stared down at his own copy of the relocation agreement, his thumb tracing the edge of the paper, as though searching for an escape route that did not exist. Priya Anand, who ran the customer relations division and had been the one to organize Sophie's 4th birthday party in the break room all those years ago, opened her mouth as if to speak on Ethan's behalf, then closed it again, glancing nervously toward Richard's end of the table. It was not cowardice exactly. It was the particular kind of paralysis that settles over good people when they sense that speaking up will cost them everything and change nothing. Ethan noticed their silence, and rather than feeling betrayed by it, felt only a quiet, sad understanding. He did not blame them. He simply realized, in that moment, that he could not count on anyone else in that room to say what needed to be said. He would have to say it himself, and he would have to mean it completely. The room went silent. Every senior director at that table knew Ethan's story. Several of them had attended Sophie's 4th birthday party, held in the office break room the year Marin had passed, when the entire team had chipped in to make sure the little girl had a cake and balloons despite everything her family was going through. But Richard Halden did not know that story, or did not care to. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and looked at Ethan with an expression of pure, cold impatience. "Mr. Cole," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "I built my career on one simple rule. The company comes first. Family, hobbies, personal circumstances, those are things you manage on your own time, not things that dictate business strategy. I am not going to restructure a $40 million contract around your babysitting schedule." He tapped the paper with 2 fingers. "So here is your choice, and I am only going to say it once. Sign this agreement and be on a plane to the new hub within 45 days, or resign, effective immediately. Do as I said, or quit." The words landed in the room like a physical blow. Several of the other directors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet Ethan's eyes. Someone near the door audibly gasped. Ethan felt something inside him go very still, the way the world goes quiet in the eye of a storm. He thought about Sophie, asleep in her booster seat in the car that morning, asking him if they could go to the pumpkin patch that weekend, like they did every year. He thought about Marin, and the promise he had made at her bedside that he would never let anything come before their daughter again. He thought about 80-hour work weeks, and a daughter growing up with a father who was never home, becoming exactly the kind of absent parent he had sworn he would never be. And then, without raising his voice, without a single dramatic gesture, Ethan stood up from the conference table, buttoned his jacket, and said, "Then I quit." The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed deafening. Richard blinked, clearly having expected Ethan to fold, to apologize, to beg for an extension, the way every other manager he had cornered over the years had done. Instead, Ethan turned and walked out of the conference room, down the hallway, and into the open-plan office, where 40 of his direct reports sat at their desks. Word had already begun to spread. Someone must have overheard through the glass, and by the time Ethan reached his cubicle, nearly every head in the department had turned to watch him. He did not explain himself. He did not make a speech. He simply reached into his bottom desk drawer, pulled out an empty cardboard box that had once held printer paper, and began, methodically, to pack up 3 years of his professional life. He unpinned Sophie's crayon drawing of their family from the corkboard, a stick figure trio, holding hands beneath a lopsided yellow sun, and set it gently on top of the stack of folders. He took the small framed photo of Marin from his desk. He gathered his notebooks, his charging cables, the ceramic mug Sophie had painted for him at a pottery class, glazed unevenly in blue and orange. Around him, the office had gone almost completely silent, the only sound the soft rustle of paper and the occasional creak of a chair as someone leaned forward to watch. Richard Halden appeared at the edge of the office a few minutes later, clearly expecting to find Ethan in a state of panic, perhaps already regretting his decision. Instead, he found a man calmly, deliberately closing out a chapter of his life with quiet dignity. "You understand," Richard said, his voice carrying across the silent floor, "that walking away from a position like this, at your level, is not something you simply undo. There won't be a second offer." Ethan paused, box now full, and looked at him. "I understand exactly what I'm walking away from," he said evenly. "The question is whether you understand what you're about to lose." He didn't wait for a response. He picked up the box, tucked it under one arm, and walked down the center aisle of the office floor, past dozens of colleagues who had worked alongside him for years, past the junior analysts he had personally mentored, past the assistant who had covered for him more times than he could count on the days Sophie had a fever. Nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. The respect in that silence was louder than any goodbye speech could have been. He reached the elevator, rode down 14 floors, and walked out through the revolving glass doors into the golden light of a late autumn afternoon. The city humming around him, indifferent to the fact that his entire career had just ended in less than 20 minutes. What Richard Halden did not know, what almost no one in that building knew, save for a handful of Ethan's closest colleagues, was that 6 weeks earlier, in the middle of negotiating that record-breaking client contract, Ethan had been quietly approached by an executive recruiter representing Meridian Freight Solutions, one of Halden Logistics' fiercest regional competitors. Meridian had been trying to poach Ethan for over a year, drawn by his reputation for building efficient, humane operations teams that consistently outperformed their larger, better-funded rivals. Ethan had turned them down twice before, out of loyalty to the team he had built, and the company Walter Kim had shaped with genuine care. But the recruiter had left the door open, telling him plainly, "Whenever you're ready. The offer stands, and it comes with something Halden never gave you, the freedom to be the father your daughter needs, and the executive we know you can be." In the days between his resignation and that phone call, Ethan allowed himself to feel the full weight of uncertainty he had been holding at bay. He sat up late into the night, running numbers on a legal pad, calculating exactly how many months his savings could cover the mortgage, the after-school program, the small emergencies that always seemed to arrive at the worst possible time. He thought about pride, and how easy it would have been to call Richard's office and negotiate some face-saving compromise, to accept a slightly softened version of the same ultimatum just to keep a paycheck flowing. He thought about what kind of example that would set for Sophie, a father who talked about courage and family at the dinner table, but folded the moment real courage was required of him. He thought about Marin, and the promise he had made, and understood that promises made in hospital rooms are only as real as the choices made to honor them when no one else is watching. It was in that stretch of sleepless, uncertain nights that the recruiter's earlier calls, which he had politely declined twice before, out of loyalty to a company that no longer resembled the one he had joined, began to look less like a temptation and more like an open door he had been too cautious to walk through. That night, sitting at his kitchen table while Sophie colored quietly beside him, humming a song from her favorite cartoon, Ethan picked up his phone and made the call. Within a week, Meridian Freight Solutions had not only offered him the position of Vice President of Operations, a full title above what his position held at Halden, but had structured the entire role around remote flexibility, guaranteed protected hours for family obligations, and a compensation package nearly 40% higher than his previous salary. Patricia had built Meridian Freight Solutions from a single regional trucking contract into a company that now rivaled Halden Logistics in size, and she had done it while raising 2 children largely on her own, after an early divorce left her balancing board meetings with parent-teacher conferences, much the way Ethan now balanced his own responsibilities. She had a reputation in the industry as tough but fair, a leader who read every performance review personally, and who had once famously rescheduled a meeting with a major investor because her son had a school science fair, a decision that had raised eyebrows at the time, but had since become something of a legend among Meridian's employees, held up as proof that the company's stated values were not merely decoration on a website. More than that, Meridian's CEO personally called Ethan to tell him that the reason she wanted him on her team wasn't despite his devotion to his daughter, but because of it. A man who fights that hard for his family, she told him, is exactly the kind of person who will fight that hard for this company. Loyalty like that isn't a liability, Mr. Cole. It's the rarest asset there is. 3 weeks after Ethan walked out of Halden Logistics with a cardboard box under his arm, the news broke across the industry that he had joined Meridian Freight Solutions as its new vice president of operations. Within his first month, using the very routing algorithm and warehouse strategy he had originally designed for Halden's record contract, Ethan helped Meridian win a competing bid for a nearly identical retail distribution deal, this time against Halden Logistics itself, which lost the contract due to what the client openly described as operational uncertainty and recent leadership instability. The $40 million deal that Richard Halden had tried to force Ethan across the pot to manage evaporated within 90 days, along with 3 other senior directors who resigned in the weeks following Ethan's forced departure, unwilling to accept the same ultimatum that had driven their most respected colleague out the door. The story did not end with corporate revenge, though there was a certain quiet justice in watching Halden Logistics stumble under the weight of a leadership philosophy that treated human beings as interchangeable parts. The real ending, the one that mattered most, happened on a Saturday morning 6 months later. At the very same pumpkin patch Ethan and Sophie visited every autumn. Sophie, now working on her 2nd year of 2nd grade, ran ahead of her father through the rows of orange pumpkins, her laughter carrying across the field, completely unaware of the storm her father had walked through to make sure this ordinary, perfect Saturday could exist without interruption. Ethan sat down on a hay bale, watching her, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for months, a quiet, steady certainty that he had made the right choice, not just for his career, but for the small, precious life that depended on him completely. Word had gotten back to him, through old colleagues who still kept in touch, that Richard Halden had eventually been asked to step down by the board of directors, less than a year after taking the CEO position, following a wave of departures, plummeting morale, and the loss of 2 more major contracts that his rigid, people-second philosophy had cost the company. He heard, too, that the board had quietly reached out to Walter Kim, the original CEO, whose steady, people-first leadership had built the company's reputation in the first place, asking whether he might consider returning in an advisory capacity to help repair the culture Richard's tenure had left in ruins. Walter had agreed, on the condition that the company formally revisit its policies on remote flexibility and family accommodation, changes that ironically would have kept Ethan at full Halden Logistics in the first place had they existed 6 months earlier. Ethan felt no satisfaction in that news, no desire for revenge fulfilled. He simply felt grateful that he had trusted his own judgment in that glass conference room, that he had chosen his daughter over a fear of the unknown, that he had proven, to himself, if to no one else, that walking away from something toxic is not weakness. It is often the bravest, clearest-headed decision a person can make. In the years that followed, Ethan often thought about how differently the story could have unfolded had he chosen fear over conviction that afternoon in the glass conference room. He thought about the version of himself who might have signed the relocation agreement, who might have spent 80-hour weeks in a city far from home, while Sophie grew up in the care of babysitters and after-school programs, who might have woken up one day, years later, successful by every corporate measure, and utterly unrecognizable to the daughter he had sacrificed everything to provide for. That version of his life had been entirely possible. It had, in fact, been the path of least resistance, the choice that would have required no confrontation, no risk, no uncomfortable walk down a silent office aisle carrying a cardboard box. But it would have cost him the only thing that had ever truly mattered. And somewhere in the quiet certainty of that hospital room years earlier, he had already known it. Sophie, now a bright, curious 8-year-old, who had inherited her mother's habit of humming while she worked, would sometimes ask her father about the drawing that hung in his new office at Meridian. The same lopsided crayon family, beneath a crooked yellow sun, that had once been pinned to a corkboard in a very different building. "Why do you keep that old one, Dad?" she asked one evening, genuinely puzzled, as children often are by the things adults treasure. Ethan had knelt down to her eye level, thought for a moment, and told her the truth in words simple enough for her to understand. "Because that drawing reminded me, on a very hard day, what actually matters," he said, "and I never want to forget it again." Sophie had considered this with the particular seriousness only a child can bring to an adult's cards. Answer: nodded once, and then asked if they could get ice cream on the way home, and Ethan had laughed, really laughed, in a way that felt like the truest measure of everything he had walked through, to arrive at that ordinary, perfect moment. If there is one thing this story leaves behind, it is this: no job, no title, no paycheck is worth sacrificing the people who depend on you most. Ethan Cole did not win because he fought back with anger, or made a scene in that conference room. He won because he knew exactly what mattered to him, and he was willing to walk through an open door into uncertainty, rather than stay chained to a desk that demanded he abandon his own daughter. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is sitting in a job that asks them to choose between their family and their paycheck, terrified that walking away means losing everything. This story is proof that sometimes walking away is exactly how you find everything you were looking for. If this story moved you even a little, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more stories like Ethan's waiting to be told. Stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage exactly when they needed it most.